All right. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we find God in all things? But I think when we are dealing with crises and we are dealing with suffering and death and oppression and injustice and violence, God asks us to look for him in the midst of the daily events that happen. So the examination of conscience has 5 parts. The first part is, this is a prayer you would do on your own, placing yourself in the presence of God. All right. And that is as simple as imagining that God is with you. Okay. Calling God's presence with you. God is always with us, but in prayer, we have to remind ourselves that it is not just us speaking to God. It's not just us speaking to ourselves. It's God with us. The second step of the examination of conscience is to call to mind the things you're grateful for. Now, again, in difficult times, if people are going through civil unrest or the pandemic or personal illness or struggle, to be able to remember things that you're grateful for is essential. So what would that be? That would be, say, a consoling word that a friend gave you, a bit of good news, right? The fact that you were able to come together, in peace, right? Something that gives you uplift, even something like a friend texts you something that makes you happy or gives you a sense of calm. So anything that you find comforting or consoling, you call it to mind, you savor it, as St. Ignatius says, and you give God thanks. Okay. Now, it's very important, again, in times of crisis, to start with the gratitude, because, again, we tend to focus on the problems, on the difficulties, and we sometimes forget where God is. The third step of the examination of conscience is a review of the day. And so this is where you go through your day from start to finish, morning, noon, and night, and try to see where God has reached out to you. Okay, where has God reached out to you? Where did you feel the presence of God? Where did you feel God's touch? Where did you feel a sense of uplift or hope? So you go through the day, the people, the events, the places, everything that you've experienced, and you ask God to reveal himself. The next step of the examine is looking at the places where we have failed and may have sinned a little bit, and we ask for God's forgiveness and pardon. And then finally, we ask for God's grace for the next day. Now, why do we do the examination of conscience? Okay. As I said, it's 5 easy steps: the presence of God, gratitude, review of the day, sorrow for your sins, and then asking for grace for the next day. Because especially when we are caught up in difficult situations, we always move to the next thing. And we don't give ourselves the time to reflect and discern and to notice, which is a very big word in Jesuit spirituality, to notice where God is active. So you might be looking forward to the next day. You might be very upset about the problems that have happened in this day, but to be able to look back and see where God has been is very helpful, right? Because it's often easier, as you know, to see where God has been rather than it is to see where God is, right? So sometimes I'm sure in your lives, even if you are young, you can look back and say, oh, now in this difficult time in the past, I see where God's hand was. So that's the idea, being able to see where God has been. There's a lovely passage in Genesis where God meets Moses, and we might want to turn. Everyone needs to mute themselves, by the way. We remember where God meets Moses, and God says to Moses, "You cannot see my face, but you can see me pass." So that's the idea, that we see where God has passed. So that's the first Ignatian tool in a crisis, the examination of conscience. The second is what's called discernment of spirits. Now, in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of difficulties, you can feel so confused and so overwhelmed that it can be hard to say, what is God calling me to do? Okay, where is God in this situation? That not only does God want us to make good decisions, but that God will help us to make good decisions. And God helps us to make good decisions oftentimes by helping us notice the different sort of impulses that we have within us. All right. So what does that mean? That means that anything that gives you more hope, more confidence, more courage, right? A sense of uplift is coming from God. So this is the way God's voice is working. That is coming from God. Anything that says, especially in the situation in Myanmar, that nothing can change, that everything is hopeless, that leads you to despair, is not coming from God. So St. Ignatius asks us to listen to these two voices. Now, you can talk about it in terms of Satan and God. You can also just, if that's not the language you like, you can also say that these are movements within us that pull us towards God or pull us away from God. And oftentimes, again, in these very difficult situations when you're facing violence and civic unrest and death, it can be hard to separate the feelings that we're feeling. And so I think a shorthand is really to say that the voice of God is the voice of hope, okay? And the voice of despair is not the voice of God. And we all have felt that across the world during the pandemic, that, nothing can change. Everything is hopeless. We'll never get through this. That is not the voice of God, okay? You might think about the apostles on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Okay, they are locked behind closed doors. Okay, they say nothing, this is terrible. Nothing can ever change, right? The crucifixion was the end. Nothing can ever happen that's going to be good again, right? They're fearful. That is not where God is leading them. God is leading them to Easter Sunday. All right, so again, the voice of God is the voice of hope and the voice of faith. So that's the second tool, this discernment of spirits. And I know that many of you know the Jesuits, and they can help you understand that if you have questions. A third tool is Ignatian Contemplation. Now, again, these things may seem like the normal Jesuit spiritual tools, but again, in a time of crisis, I find this very helpful. What is Ignatian Contemplation? It is a tool for prayer that enables you to really meet Christ in a very personal way, right? Or meet God in a very personal way. And it is basically using your imagination, okay? Using your imagination to place yourself in a scripture scene or to imagine yourself speaking with God. So what does that mean? All right, well, let's take a gospel reading that probably has meant a lot to you, which is the storm at sea. So you all remember the story of the storm at sea, right? Jesus is in the boat on the Sea of Galilee with the disciples, right? It's very dark. A storm comes up. Now, remember, in those days, the water was a symbol of chaos and evil and destruction, right? And this is one reason, God separates the waters in the book of Genesis to show his power over the waters, because waters were seen as a sign of destruction. And of course, you could drown in the water. In any event, the disciples are very upset that Jesus seems to be asleep and not paying attention to them. So he stands up and they ask him, "Don't you care about us?" He stands up, he rebukes the waves, and they calm. And the disciples say, "Who is this that even the wind and the waves obey him?" Now, that's a gospel passage that Pope Francis used at the beginning of the pandemic, right? To kind of give us a sense of, how we feel in this world. And certainly in your country these days, you probably feel tossed about by the waves and by the storm. In Ignatian Contemplation, you imagine yourself in that scene. So you literally say, you close your eyes and you say, "What do I see?" Right? What does the boat look like? Okay. You don't have to know what a boat in first century Galilee looks like. To just imagine a boat. What did the disciples look like? What is the storm like? Well, it's night outside. And you start to get a sense already of the disciples' fear, right? It being so dark. What does it sound like? What do you hear? Well, you're going to hear the waves and the wind. You start to get more of a sense of the fear. What do you feel, right? You're using all your senses. Well, you're probably cold if the wind and the waves are sort of blowing on you. What do you smell? What do you taste, right? All sorts of things that you can use to, as St. Ignatius says, compose the place. Now, why do you do this? Well, you do this to enter into the scene in a very deep way. And all sorts of things can come up: emotions, desires, memories, feelings, even insights. So, for example, let's say during this difficult time in your country, you are praying about the storm at sea, and you start to feel a surprising emotion. You start to feel angry that Jesus is asleep in the boat. And you say, "Where are you, Jesus?" Right? "Where are you, Jesus? Where can I see you?" Now, you might have an insight that, wow, just like the disciples were angry and not trusting in God, I feel the same way. So that might be something that God is raising up for you in prayer, right? It might be something that God is raising up that you can talk about with God in prayer. In the Ignatian Contemplation, you can encounter these stories in a very personal way. And so raising up that anger at God or that disappointment would be something to speak to God about. And then the next step would be to see, well, Jesus is able to calm the waves. And so it's an invitation maybe to trust. Or you may have a memory or an image that comes up during that prayer. The famous image we just saw of the sister kneeling before the military forces in Myanmar, which was all over the world, that image may come up to you. You may have a sense of, well, there is God, right? I was worried about where God was absent, and there's a sign of God. So all these things can come up in your prayer in Ignatian contemplation, and it can give you, I would say, a refuge, right? A place to go, a place of consolation, a place to sort of nourish you, where you feel, buffeted by the storm outside. So I would really encourage Ignatian contemplation. So those are 3 Ignatian tools that I would recommend. First, the examination of conscience. Second, discernment of spirits. And third, Ignatian contemplation. I want to talk a little bit about the experience also of opposition and suffering, okay, especially during this time in your country. One of the things that I think is very important to remember, especially as we're moving into Lent, right, and we're reading stories about Jesus being rejected, okay, is to really get a sense of what that opposition was like for him, okay? And so oftentimes we might read the gospel stories and we think, well, Jesus was opposed for religious reasons, and, there were a lot of different reasons why people opposed him. I think we can miss out on the hatred and the anger, and the violence and the real brutality that Jesus suffered. Okay, now, the first thing to remember is that when we pray to Jesus in this situation in your country, we are praying to someone who understands these things, not only because he is divine and understands all things as God, but because he is human and experienced all these things, right? So Jesus, when you are praying to Jesus and when you're asking for Jesus's help, you are praying to someone who experienced these things, who experienced injustice, who experienced oppression at the hands of military leaders, right? I mean, Pontius Pilate is a soldier, okay? So he understands these things. So I think that's very important in terms of our relationship with Jesus, to remember fully human and fully divine means he understands all things, not only because he's divine, but because he experienced all of these things. Also, I think it's important in a sense to expect opposition, right? As Christians, all right? Christ comes into the world, and because he has come into a world that is unjust, that is sinful, he expects the suffering. Okay. The last few days, if you've been reading the daily gospels, it's Jesus in a sense predicting the suffering. Yesterday was the parable of the landowner's son, where a landowner sends his son to meet with the tenants and they kill him, right? It's a very brutal reading. It's a brutal parable because Jesus understands what is about to happen to him. And as a great American Catholic, Dorothy Day, used to say, and I find this very helpful, if they did that to Jesus, why would they not do it to us? So I think oftentimes when we face opposition, we feel that maybe we are doing something wrong, or maybe we are misunderstanding something. But I think this is part of the Christian life, right? This is part of taking up one's cross. That doesn't make it just. It's just a part of the Christian life, right? That living out the Christian message is necessarily going to bring us opposition, but we are with someone who understands us in all of our suffering. I also think, it's important to look at this question of suffering, right now, of where is God in this suffering? And certainly you can say, we see signs of God in the courage of the people in Myanmar, right? In the courage of people in the church. But when you look at questions of, why has this person been killed? Why has that person been killed? I think there are really no good answers that one can give, right? I think any answer that one can give in the face of suffering can be really hollow. My experience is to say that we don't have to understand exactly why these things are happening to a particular person. For example, if a friend of yours has been injured or, God forbid, killed, to say, why did this happen? I think sometimes those questions have no answer, and it really is a mystery, right? I think the invitation, though, is to trust in a God who we may not understand, right? Whose purposes and whose plan right now we may not understand. But at the same time, to be united with Jesus, okay, who understands us, right? And who participates in our suffering and who participates in our desire for justice. Which brings me to the next point. I can't stress this enough, which is this. The main way that I believe that God works through us, okay, is through our hearts and our consciences and our desires. Okay, so for all of you who desire justice in Myanmar, for all of you who desire peace in Myanmar, for all of you who desire reconciliation in Myanmar, you have to ask yourself, I think, where are these desires coming from? These desires are coming from God. This is the one way that God has of working through us, through our emotions, through our desires, okay? How else would God effect change in the world other than by moving our hearts, okay? By moving our hearts. And that, again, is why it's so important to exercise discernment of spirits. Because when you feel these emotions, when you feel these impulses, to sort of look at where they're coming from and to be sure they are coming from God. But I guess I want to encourage you to trust the desire for justice as something that is coming from God. Okay, that is a real thing. And finally, I would say that we are called as people who follow Jesus to work actively for justice and for peace. Okay, we have a great example today of Pope Francis in Iraq, okay, talking about the greatest blasphemy of all is hating our brothers and sisters. And so in this desire for justice, to work for peace, to work for reconciliation, and to never lose sight of this fundamental insight that everyone is our brother and sister. And we can never hate our brother and sister if we are going to be working for peace and reconciliation. So that's just a brief overview of some things that I'd like to share with you, some Ignatian tools, some insights on suffering, and particularly the way that Jesus participates in that with us and understands oppression, right? Especially from military powers, and then just a call for peace and reconciliation in all that we do. So thanks very much. I'm happy to answer your questions. I much prefer listening to questions than I do listening to myself talk. So I'm happy to chat with you.